Welcome to the Damascus Road podcast. On the road to Damascus, Paul had a radical encounter with Jesus and his life was changed forever. That is what we hope and pray for here. Now, on to this week's episode.
So I want to start today with two stories, and I want to apologize up front because these stories are pretty heavy. And that's because forgiveness is not an easy topic. The hurts that we experience in this life can be really, really terrible, and the path of forgiveness is not flippant. It is not to be taken lightly because hurt is really real. Now, one story is about a daughter, and the other story is about a sister, and both are about terrible things that people do to each other, and what we choose to do in the face of that pain. So, a story about a daughter. In November 1984, Candace Dirksen went missing on her way home from school in Winnipeg, Canada. She was 13 years old, the only child of Wilma and Cliff Dirksen. For weeks, the city searched for her as the Canadian winter pressed on, knowing that the story will never be good when a 13-year-old girl goes missing. 6.5 weeks later, her body was found frozen not far from her family's home. She was hogtied with rope, and whoever had abducted her had left her on the floor of an industrial storage shed in sub-zero temperatures to freeze to death. Candace's mother, Wilma Dirksen, recounts the terrible day her daughter's body was found. The day her body was found, all her friends came to visit, bringing warm food with them. There was so much love in the house that it helped us get through. Then at around 10:30 that evening, when most people had left, there was a knock on the door, and the stranger stood there. He told us, "I'm the parent of a murdered child, too." He was saying we now belong to an exclusive club that no one wants to belong to. We invited him to the kitchen table, and for the next 2 hours, he told us in vivid detail everything he'd lost: his health, his relationships, his concentration, his ability to work. He'd even lost all memory of his daughter because now he could only think of the murder, the trauma, and the hate that followed. What do you do in the face of something terrible? What do you do when faced with the horror of what someone has done to someone that you love? This is how another family responds to the unforgivable, the story of a sister. One day, Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, went to visit some of the young women who lived in the area. But when the local prince, Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, saw Dinah, he seized her and he raped her. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the field as soon as they heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious that their sister had been raped. Shechem had done a disgraceful thing against Jacob's family, something that should never be done. What do you do in the face of something terrible? What do you do when faced with the horror of what someone has done to someone that you love? This is what Dinah's brothers did. Since Shechem had defiled their sister Dinah, Jacob's sons responded deceitfully to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, "We couldn't possibly allow your marriage to our sister because you're not circumcised. It would be a disgrace for our sister to marry a man like you. But here's a solution. If every man among you will be circumcised like we are, then we will give you our daughters and we'll take your daughters for ourselves. We will live among you and become one people." So all the men in the town council agreed with Hamor and Shechem, and every male in the town was circumcised. But 3 days later, when their wounds were still sore, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, who were Dinah's full brothers, took their swords and entered the town without opposition. Then they slaughtered every male there, including Hamor and his son Shechem. They killed them with their swords, then took Dinah from Shechem's house and returned to their camp. Meanwhile, the rest of Jacob's sons arrived. Finding the men slaughtered, they plundered the town because their sister had been defiled there. They seized all the flocks and herds and donkeys, everything they could lay their hands on, both inside the town and outside in the fields. They looted all their wealth and plundered their houses. They also took all their little children and wives and led them away as captives. Hurting is natural. Faced with the unthinkable, your daughter being murdered, your sister being raped, the natural response is more hurt. It's trauma, it's hate. The cycle of hurt is never broken as hurt begets hurt begets hurt. And when we face hurts, the natural response in our hearts and bodies is to rise up with our swords and to strike back. We want the one who hurt us to feel the pain that they inflicted, to make them suffer the way that we have suffered. It's only fair that one hurt deserves another. But in the midst of this understandable and natural desire for revenge and retaliation, there is another way. Simeon and Levi responded to the terrible act committed against their sister by slaughter. But this is how Wilma and Cliff responded to the murder of their 13-year-old daughter after hearing the descent into hate and loss of this other wounded father. Cliff and I went to bed that night, horrified by the graphic picture he'd painted. Having just been through the pain of losing our daughter, it now seemed we might lose everything else as well. So we made a decision that night that we would respond differently, and we chose the path of forgiveness. What do you do in the face of something terrible? What do you do when faced with the horror of what someone has done to someone you love? There are two paths before us. There's one of hate and hurt and loss and perpetuation of the cycle. And then there's one of forgiveness. Both are terrible in their own ways. Both are incredibly difficult, but one leads to life and the other leads to death. This is what we are exploring this morning as we continue our series on forgiveness. In the face of unthinkable evil and hurt, how do you choose a different path? How do you choose the path of forgiveness? So we've been going through the REACH model of forgiveness by clinical psychologist and professor Everett Worthington, and we're now on to step 4. So here's a recap so far. It's an acronym. So R is recall the hurt. E is empathize with the one who hurt you. A is give them the altruistic gift of forgiveness. And now we're on step C, commit to that forgiveness. So at this point, we have processed what has happened to us. We've created compassion in our hearts for the one who hurt us. We have reckoned with the reality of what forgiveness truly means, that we will be paying the price instead of them, and that it is a gift freely offered. And so at this point, now that we've processed and empathized and understand what it is we are doing when we offer forgiveness, it is time to make a decision. Will we forgive or will we not? This is step C. Now, at this point in our forgiveness journey, we may still be a long way off from full emotional forgiveness. We've talked a lot about the difference between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness thus far. So decisional forgiveness is the choice to forgive someone, where you decide to not pay back a hurt with a hurt and you end the cycle of retaliation. And this is very different from emotional forgiveness. Emotional forgiveness is not a choice that you can simply will. Instead, it is the steady and ongoing process of replacing negative, unforgiving emotions towards the wrongdoer with more positive emotions. Decisional forgiveness is more about a single, one-time commitment, while emotional forgiveness is an ongoing process of realigning your heart and feelings with the decisional forgiveness that you made. So today's step C is that choice of decisional forgiveness. We are at a crossroads in our forgiveness journey where we have to decide, will I forgive this person or not? And our choice here is critical because one choice leads to life and one choice leads to death. We saw in the story of a daughter how the wounded father had not chosen forgiveness for the murder of his daughter. And that is a very understandable choice to make. I don't know what I would do if someone murdered Catherine or Alva and I had to live with that reality. How do you forgive the unforgivable? But we also see the result of this seemingly rational choice of unforgiveness. Rather than creating life and flourishing, this father's unforgiveness generates hate and loss and death. He says he lost his health, his relationships, his concentration, his ability to work. He even lost all memory of his daughter because now he'd only think of the murder, the trauma, and the hate that followed. The choice of unforgiveness, while totally understandable, simply created more death and suffering in this already suffering man's life. And in the story of the sisters, Simeon and Levi and the rest of Dinah's brothers all similarly choose to not forgive Shechem for what he did. Again, a totally understandable choice. What do you do in the face of something unforgivable? Well, for Dinah's brothers, it was to do something unforgivable in return. Because in response to their hurt, Simeon and Levi slaughter a whole town of men, people who had nothing to do with their sister's rape other than happening to live next to the rapist. They destroy an entire city, pillaging it, looting it, rending families, and setting this whole generation of children on a path of slavery. Shechem did something unforgivable. And in response, Simeon and Levi do something unforgivable. Because what now is the story of these children? A man came into my house when I was 11 years old and chopped my father to pieces in front of me. And then he pulled my mom, screaming from the house by her hair. Then they kicked me and beat me, and now I'm a slave to the man who murdered my father. This child's life is now defined by hurt because of her hurt, followed by a hurt, followed by her hurt. The unforgivable just keeps happening on repeat over and over. And this is not the way to life. In the book of Deuteronomy, God warns his people. He says, "Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice that you make. Oh, that you would choose life, so that you and your descendants might live." Because you see, unforgiveness always results in death. Now, it may not be the physical death that Simeon and Levi wreak upon the city of Shechem, but it's also the diminishing of life and flourishing that we see with his unforgiving father. Unforgiveness binds us to hate and bitterness, and those will always decay and subvert the flourishing not only of your life, but of the lives of everyone around you. But forgiveness opens up the path to life. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but Simeon and Levi, the brothers of Dinah, who was raped, are also the brothers of someone else that we've been spending a lot of time with this series, Joseph. Now, Simeon and Levi are really good at perpetuating hurt. When they are hurt by their father's blatant favoritism and lack of unconditional love that you hope for from a parent, they also respond by hurting, this time by selling their favored baby brother Joseph into slavery. And while their hurt is understandable, choosing this path of unforgiveness just creates more understandable hurt. Because what is Joseph's story now? When I was 17, a man, my brother, kicked me into a pit. And as I screamed and begged for mercy, he took away my life, my family, my culture, my freedom, and sold me to strangers to die as a slave. The unforgivable on repeat. Over and over and over, death begetting death begetting death. And here's where another chance to repay the unforgivable arises as that 17-year-old boy becomes a 39-year-old man, the most powerful man in Egypt, with his brothers, the ones who did the unthinkable to him, now at his feet. What is the natural response to hurt? It's to hurt back. We repay the unforgivable with something else unforgivable. With Joseph perpetrators at his feet, it would be totally understandable for Joseph to repay them for the wrong that they had done to him. Easily, he could have said, "You asked me for food? Well, you should have thought about that before you betrayed me and sold me into slavery and left me for dead. I will not give you food. Go home and suffer the consequences of your poor choices. Starve to death with your wives and little children and figure it out yourselves. I won't lift a finger to help you, since you couldn't lift a finger to help me." That is the natural, understandable response. But this unforgiveness still leads to death. Here, the literal death of Joseph's brothers and their families and their children as they starve to death in his homeland. But there is another response. It is not a natural or understandable response, but it's a response that leads to life. This is what Joseph actually says to the brothers that betrayed him and hurt him and did the unforgivable all those years ago. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But don't feel badly. Don't blame yourselves for selling me. God was behind it. God sent me ahead of you to save lives. There's been a famine in the land now for 2 years. The famine will continue for 5 more years, neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me on ahead to pave the way and make sure that there was a remnant in the land to save your lives in an amazing act of deliverance. God sent me ahead of you to save lives. When Joseph chooses the path of forgiveness, he literally chooses life for himself, for his brothers, for his families, for their children. His choice of forgiveness begets life. And this is the paradox of forgiveness. Choosing to forgive, to let someone off the hook for the wrong they did to you, to pay the price for the hurt yourself instead of making them pay, it is unfair. It's a death. It is a sacrifice of self and justice and what is deserved and what is fair. Instead of you dying, I die. But paradoxically, we find that in that death, there is life. Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Forgiveness is the way of Jesus. And even though it does not feel natural, it doesn't feel understandable, Jesus tells us that the only way to find life in the midst of incredible hurt is to die. To die to our need for retribution, to die to our need to be justified, to die to our rights. Like Jesus on the cross, we take the undeserved cost of the hurt and we pay it instead of the perpetrator. And in this incredibly painful and unfair death, we find the way to life. God sets before us a choice between life and death when we face the inevitable, unforgivable hurts in our life. You can choose to not forgive. You can continue the cycle of hurt and experience the spreading of death and destruction and pain. Or you can choose the incredibly painful and sacrificial decision of forgiveness, the choice of death. But it is the only way forward into life. So how do we do the seemingly impossible? How do we make the choice of forgiveness in the face of incredible hurt, betrayal, and pain? Because it's not natural and it is not understandable. And I would argue that it is not possible on your own. Deuteronomy continues, you can make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and committing yourself firmly to him. This is the key to your life. Hurting is natural, but forgiveness is supernatural. We can only do it with God, and we do it by committing ourselves firmly to him and his way. And Jesus models this for us in the Garden of Gethsemane, where his desire is to run away from what's about to happen, to run away from the injustice, the pain, the incredible difficulty of paying the cost of something that he doesn't know. He prays to God, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. The choice between forgiveness and unforgiveness is not an easy one. The decision to forgive will clash with our own will and sense of justice and retribution and fairness. It will feel like death. But we can submit our wills to God's will in the way that Jesus models for us and actively choosing God's way, knowing and trusting that this paradoxical death is the way to life. Wilma Dirksen, the mother of Candace, shares, forgiveness is a counterintuitive choice to begin a process of a positive, proactive way of dealing with things. And it begins with that choice. The usual choices are flight, fright, freeze, despair, and yet there is another response. We will always do these, and there is nothing wrong with them, but we can turn it around. Now, one of the things to recognize as we make this choice of forgiveness is that it is step 4 in the process. The choice to forgive is not something to be taken lightly, or to feel obligated to choose or to rush into. It is a hard choice. And so if you are going to commit to the path of forgiveness, you need to be able to walk into it with your eyes wide open of what exactly you are committing to. Joseph does not choose to forgive his brothers at age 17 when they sell him into slavery. 22 years pass between the time that he was hurt and the time he chooses to forgive. During that time, he remembers redemptively his story. He processes the hurt that was done to him. He centers himself and his worth in God. He empathetically understands his brothers. He reckons with the emotional sacrifice that it will take to forgive them. We need time to arrive at a decision of forgiveness because it is not something to be taken lightly. Now, I find that a marriage vow is a really helpful analogy for me when thinking about forgiveness. My husband Ryan and I have been married for almost 12 years in March. And you start out with talking to each other. So you talk, you get to know him, you're like, oh, you're cool. And then he's like, I think you're cool too. And you're like, excellent, let's do this. But we don't get married right there. I'm not going to commit to a man that I just met 2 weeks ago. I guess some people do that, but I didn't. So you talk, then you start dating, then you meet their families, then you start working through conflict. You have your first fight, you resolve it. Then you decide maybe we should do some premarital counseling. You work through your counseling issues. Then you get engaged, and then finally you arrive at the point of where you get married. And when you get married, you stand in front of your family and your friends and your community and God, and you make a choice that I am going to love this person in sickness and in health, for good or for worse, until one of us dies. And that is a huge choice to make. And your feelings are not always going to match the man, but I do not always feel like loving him. Sometimes he's annoying. Sometimes he does things that hurt my feelings. Like, I don't want to be kind to you anymore. But that's not the choice I made. Ooh. That's okay. But that's not the choice I made. On March 9th of 2013, I committed to him and to God that I would choose to love him no matter what. And so whether my feelings match that choice or not, I choose to love him. And forgiveness is the same way. This is decisional forgiveness, not emotional forgiveness. In the same way that I choose to love Ryan despite my feelings, we choose to forgive someone despite our feelings. This is not saying that you will always feel like you have forgiven them. You will not always feel lovey-dovey towards them or close to them, but you will say, I made a choice and I'm going to live in the reality of that choice I made. Wilma Dirksen describes it like this. She says, you do not forgive in one big leap. It does not spare you the darkness, fear, anger, stuckness, or despair. These are instinctive. But each time we felt these, we would intentionally choose a different way, and that is forgiveness. The choice of forgiveness does not spare you hurt feelings, darkness, or despair, but you can now choose something different when you feel those. You intentionally choose forgiveness. So I want to put before you, are you ready to make the choice of forgiveness? We know that forgiveness is the paradoxical path to life in the midst of hurt, and it is the only way to life. But I want to caution you not to take this first step until you are ready. Just like you don't rush into marriage, don't rush into this choice of forgiveness, because I want you to be sure of the commitment that you are making when you make this decision. Because once you make it, you will have to treat that person as if you've forgiven them. When Joseph forgives his brothers, it tangibly changes the way that he interacts with them. He embraces them, he weeps over them, and he tangibly cares for them, not just with words, but also actions. Joseph tells his brothers, now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you there. For there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise you, your household, and all your animals will starve. Joseph doesn't just say that he forgives his brothers. he treats them as if he's forgiven them. He treats them well. He says he will take care of them. He says, come live near me. He doesn't speak poorly about them. He acts in love towards them, caring for their physical needs, their families, and their well-being. And if you're still on this process of forgiving the person that you're forgiving, this can feel terrible. Like, what about justice? What about paying for what they did to him? Am I just supposed to be nice to the person who hurt me and not hold them accountable? Am I just supposed to pretend like nothing happened now? No. But if you are still struggling with these feelings of justice and fairness and retribution, you might not be ready yet to choose forgiveness. Wilma Dirksen explores the complexity of forgiveness and justice, saying, another way of looking at it is love first and justice second. We can only do one thing at a time, so we must start with love. We must choose if we are going to do justice or going to do love. Love by itself is permissive. Justice by itself is violent and abusive. We always need the two together, so we choose to love first. For when I love first, then I can do justice better. In forgiveness, I am not saying that justice doesn't matter. What that man did to Candace Dirksen was not okay. What Shechem did to Dinah was not okay. But I would argue with Wilma Dirksen that we need to choose love first so that then we can do justice better. When we choose to forgive, we choose life through our death rather than the death of the other, and we experience the supernatural, because hurting is natural, but forgiveness is supernatural. All right. So if you are ready to make that decision of forgiveness and feel like you are ready to commit to that, I want to encourage you to make it official. So just like you have a marriage certificate, this nice little piece of paper that you and your minister and your witnesses sign, we will have a forgiveness certificate for you to sign. This is going to mark the before and after of your choice. So if you are struggling with the feelings of, I don't feel kindly towards this person, I don't want to forgive them anymore, you have a tangible reminder of, on this day, I chose to forgive this person, and now I have to live into that reality that I chose. So again, this is why I'm saying don't take this decision lightly, because you have to hold yourself accountable to that decision that you made. And once you have decided to forgive them, you have to treat them as if you've forgiven them. This is how pastor and author John Ortberg describes how he lives that out. He says, I will choose to see the other as a valuable and worthwhile human being. I will no longer allow myself to indulge rumination. I won't gossip. I won't try to pay them back. And I will earnestly seek to replace my negative feelings with positive feelings with God's help. And that last part is really important, with God's help. You can't do it on your own. I know we like to think that we're awesome and that we can do anything, but you can't do forgiveness by yourself. You are not supernatural, but God is. And he has walked this path before us, forgiving the unforgivable and laying down in death so that he and all of us can have life. In her walk of forgiveness, Wilma says, in Isaiah 30:21, God says, I will be with you to guide you. So if I made a wrong turn, then I was assured that I would be corrected. That was not the way. Try another path. Forgiveness is a beautiful way to live because you cannot fail. God forgives, and you forgive. And the writer and thinker Malcolm Gladwell went to meet with Wilma Dirksen when he was writing his book, David and Goliath, which is exploring unlikely places of strength. Gladwell grew up as a Christian, but he left his faith as a young adult, and he spent decades of his life not following Jesus. But when he met Wilma Dirksen, the mother of a young girl who was abducted and left to die in a shed, he encountered something supernatural that could only be explained by the power and presence of a good and beautiful God. Here's how he describes that. What I understand now is that I was one of those who did not appreciate the weapons of the Spirit. I've always been someone attracted to the quantifiable and the physical. I hate to admit it. I've always believed in God. I have grasped the logic of Christian faith. What I have had a hard time seeing is God's power. I put that sentence in the past tense because something happened to me when I sat in Wilma Dirkson's garden. It was one thing to read in a history book about people empowered by their faith, but it is quite another to meet an otherwise very ordinary person in the backyard of a very ordinary house who has managed to do something utterly extraordinary. Their daughter was murdered. And the first thing the Dirksons did was to stand up at the press conference and talk about the path to forgiveness. We would like to know who the person or persons are so we could share, hopefully, a love that seems to be missing in these people's lives. Maybe we have difficulty seeing the weapons of the Spirit because we don't know where to look or because we are distracted by the louder claims of material advantage. But I've seen them now, and I will never be the same. Forgiveness changes lives. Forgiveness creates life in you and in me and our children and their children, the lives of our enemies and wrongdoers in the world. It shatters the brokenness of retaliation. It changes the stories of generations where we choose to lay down our lives for the sake of the other, and we find something extraordinary. Hurting is natural, but forgiveness is supernatural. God has put before us life and death. Now choose life, that you may live. Let's pray. God, we acknowledge that this path of forgiveness is hard and is unnatural, and that it seems so counterintuitive to choose forgiveness, and that doesn't seem like the right way forward. But we trust you and know that you have modeled this way before us, and that it leads to life. I ask that you soften our hearts, Lord, that you give us courage and bravery to commit to forgiveness, so that we can truly experience life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for joining the Damascus Road podcast. Our mission is to follow Jesus together by being with God, loving everyone, transforming people, developing leaders, growing new ministries, and changing the world. You can find out more about us online at DamascusRoadTucson.com.